Hello, and welcome to the third session in our three-part series of staff presentations on the monitoring and remediation process component of QC 1000, the PCAOB's new quality control standard. Today's presentation specifically covers performing root cause analysis on QC deficiencies and designing, implementing, and testing remedial actions. My name is Skylar Sims, and I am an assistant in the Office of the Chief Auditor. Given the intent of this staff presentation to focus only on one aspect of the monitoring and remediation process component, we will not be discussing all of the nuances of the standard and related amendments. I encourage participants to read the adopting release in order to gain a more complete understanding of the new standard and related amendments and explore our other implementation resources, including staff guidance. All of this can be found on the PCAOB's website. Before we get started, I'll state our standard disclaimer. The views expressed are offered in my capacity as staff of the PCAOB's Office of the Chief Auditor, but they are my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the board as a whole, any individual board members, or other PCAOB staff. As a reminder, we prepared other staff presentations covering other parts of the monitoring and remediation process component, including the objective of the monitoring and remediation process, general requirements for monitoring and remediation, requirements related to designing and performing monitoring activities for engagements and the QC system itself, how to determine if engagement deficiencies exist, how to respond to engagement deficiencies, including the auditor's responsibility to respond to engagement deficiencies on completed engagements under an amended and retitled AS 2901, responding to engagement deficiencies after issuance of the auditor's report, and how to determine if QC observations and QC deficiencies exist. These Part 1 and Part 2 staff presentations are available on our QC implementation webpage located on the PCAOB's website. In our previous staff presentations, we focused on how to design and perform activities to monitor engagements and QC system, how to determine whether engagement deficiencies exist and how to respond to them, how to determine whether QC observations and QC deficiencies exist. Today's presentation will focus on performing root cause analysis on QC deficiencies and designing, implementing, and testing remedial actions. Okay, let's get started by discussing performing root cause analysis on QC deficiencies. QC 1000 requires the firm to perform a root cause analysis of all QC deficiencies. Root cause analysis involves identifying and evaluating the causal factors that led to each QC deficiency. What happened and why? Proper determination of the causal factors that led to the QC deficiency is essential to developing effective remedial actions. Root cause analysis looks for different types of causes through investigating the patterns of negative effects, finding hidden flaws in the QC system, and discovering specific actions that contributed to the problem. At times, it might be effective to combine similar QC deficiencies and perform root cause analysis on them collectively rather than on an individual basis. QC 1000 doesn't specify how a firm should perform root cause analysis. The firm's approach can vary, and procedures could take different forms depending on the circumstances, which allows for scalability. Some example procedures include interviewing engagement team members and firm leadership, using proprietary tools to analyze large amounts of data, and considering available performance metrics such as engagement hours, training records, audit milestones, or partner experience. Some examples of key elements that may lead to more robust and comprehensive root cause analysis include monitoring audit deficiencies identified and performing root cause analysis on a continual basis. This allows firms to obtain information that allows them to react more timely and implement remedial actions to reduce recurring deficiencies in other audits. Process mapping at the engagement level and the firm level of the underlying workflows of how a firm conducts its practice. A well-defined process makes it easier to analyze negative events to determine what went wrong. Measuring in real time the effectiveness of remedial actions and audit quality improvement plans or initiatives to identify whether remedial efforts are effective. Consideration of both positive and negative quality events, i.e., actions, behaviors, or conditions that resulted in positive or negative outcomes, to identify whether such actions, behaviors, or conditions were present on engagements where QC deficiencies were identified. As a reminder, some firms might seek assistance from other participants in performing their QC-related activities. Regardless of any QC-related activities performed by an other participant, the firm is ultimately responsible for its QC system. To the extent that a firm uses other participants in the design, implementation, or operation of its QC system, there are a number of quality objectives that would need to be established and met by the firm relating to their use of the other participants. For more discussion of this point, please refer to the Overview of QC 1000 Requirements staff presentation published in November of 2024. An effective root cause analysis allows the firm to demonstrate how the firm meets its responsibilities under paragraph 59C of QC 1000. That is, to remediate identified engagement deficiencies and QC deficiencies and take any other required actions in relation to such deficiencies in accordance with the applicable professional and legal requirements on a timely basis, and ultimately to be able to opine on the effectiveness of its QC system annually. Under QC 1000, the nature, timing, and extent of the root cause analysis is required to be commensurate with the nature, severity, and pervasiveness of the QC deficiency. So, a QC deficiency that could affect multiple engagements may require more urgent root cause analysis depending on the circumstances. To illustrate, a QC deficiency related to a firm's approach to testing business combinations would be more urgent if a firm's clients regularly enter into such transactions. After taking into account the nature, severity, and pervasiveness of the QC deficiency, root cause analysis may be performed at different points in time or, depending on the size and nature of the firm, operate as more of a continual process throughout the year. This allows firms to obtain information that allows them to react more timely and implement remedial actions to reduce recurring deficiencies in other audits. In some instances, the causal factors may be relatively apparent and therefore require less analysis than in a situation where the cause of the deficiency is complex and requires significant investigation and analysis. When the causal factors are not relatively apparent, generally, the more thorough the analysis, the more likely the causal factors will be identified, and the greater likelihood that the firm could design and implement remediation efforts that will be effective in preventing similar QC deficiencies from occurring again. Finally, let's discuss remedial actions to address QC deficiencies. Firms are required to design and implement timely remedial actions to respond to QC deficiencies, taking into account the results of the firm's root cause analysis and the nature, severity, and pervasiveness of the QC deficiency. On the next slide, I'll highlight the requirements related to designing, implementing, and testing remedial actions. But before I do that, One important distinction I want to make regarding remedial actions is the difference between the remedial actions required under QC 1000 and the PCAOB's assessment of a firm's remedial efforts in response to quality control criticisms identified during PCAOB inspections. These are distinct concepts, and they are subject to different processes, guidance, and objectives. So, remedial actions regarding QC deficiencies under QC 1000, as we'll discuss in this webinar, paragraphs 75 and 76 of QC 1000 describe QC 1000 requirements with respect to a firm's remediation of QC deficiencies. With respect to these requirements, the firm should consult QC 1000 and its related implementation guidance. Regarding the PCAOB's assessment of remedial actions in response to QC criticisms identified during an inspection, if the PCAOB identifies a QC criticism during an inspection of a firm, and if the firm remediates that criticism within 1 year to the board's satisfaction, the criticism remains non-public in a PCAOB inspection report. The board's assessment of the firm's efforts to remediate a QC criticism identified during an inspection is governed by Section 104G2 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act and PCAOB Rule 4009, and that process is the subject of separate PCAOB staff guidance. So firms are required to design and implement timely remedial actions to respond to QC deficiencies, taking into account the results of the firm's root cause analysis and the nature, severity, and pervasiveness of the QC deficiency. So for example, where there is a high risk of severity or pervasiveness, remedial actions may have to be immediate to be considered timely. The firm is expected to respond in a manner that would mitigate the occurrence of additional QC deficiencies related to similar underlying causes. I want to make a few other points related to remedial actions. So first, in some circumstances, due to the extent of remedial actions necessary to address the QC deficiency, a firm might design and implement temporary remedial actions until permanent actions can be designed and implemented. For example, a firm could design and implement supplemental audit practice aids to address QC deficiencies until the firm is able to revise its comprehensive audit methodology. In other situations, a complex QC deficiency may result in the firm developing a multi-step plan with milestones necessary to be achieved as the firm designs and implements its remedial actions. And lastly, the extent of remedial actions the firm needs to take to address a particular QC deficiency may be reduced by other compensating responses that the firm has in place and that may address the same quality risk. If the remedial actions, including any relevant compensating responses, have been tested and found effective in addressing the issue, the firm might determine, based on the facts and circumstances, that no further remedial action is necessary. This is an important point to note that compensating responses cannot form part of the firm's evaluation of whether a QC deficiency exists, but compensating responses may only be considered when determining what actions a firm will need to take in order to remediate the QC deficiency. QC 1000 also requires firms to monitor the implementation and operating effectiveness of remedial actions to determine whether they were implemented as designed and operate effectively to remediate the QC deficiency. If not, the firm takes timely actions until the monitoring activities indicate the QC deficiency was remediated. Timely actions could include, among other things, adjusting the implemented remedial actions, designing and implementing additional remedial actions, or performing additional root cause analysis to determine if other causes exist, and if so, designing and implementing remedial actions to address such causes. And I want to say a little more about this point. In particular, the importance of monitoring the effectiveness of remedial actions to determine whether other causal factors exist. For example, when performing additional root cause analysis, it may show that a lack of training caused deficiencies in a complex audit or accounting area that is common to the firm's engagements. But it may also lead to the identification of other problems in the same area, such as inadequate audit methodology or a missed consultation due to the lack of a well understood, robust consultation process. Under QC 1000, what constitutes timely depends on the deficiency's nature, scope, and impact. For example, where there is a high risk of severity or pervasiveness, remedial actions may have to be immediate to be considered timely. Once additional remedial actions are taken, the firm continues monitoring activities until it determines that the QC deficiency has been remediated. A firm may determine the root cause of a QC deficiency is related to the use of a resource or service provided by a third-party provider. This could include, among other things, working with the third-party provider to design and implement remedial actions or deciding to end the relationship with the third-party provider. And as part of the firm's remedial actions, revising its policies and procedures in the area affected. Finally, if a firm belongs to a network and uses network resources or services, a root cause of a QC deficiency could be related to the network resource or service being provided. And in these cases, remedial actions taken by the firm could be coordinated with the network or designed and implemented exclusively by the firm. In either situation, the firm is ultimately responsible for addressing the effect of the deficiency on its QC system, determining whether remedial actions taken sufficiently remediate the deficiency, and in the case of network providers, this determination is irrespective of whether the remedial actions taken by the firm are coordinated with the network or designed and implemented exclusively by the firm. So that concludes our Part 3 presentation in the series of staff presentations on the monitoring and remediation process. As a recap, today we've covered requirements related to performing root cause analysis on QC deficiencies and designing, implementing, and testing remedial actions. Before we wrap up today's staff presentation, I just want to remind everyone of our QC implementation webpage located on the PCAOB's website. We continue to update it as we develop additional implementation resources. These include a staff presentation of an overview of QC 1000, as well as staff guidance documents covering aspects of QC 1000 and the related amendments to AS 2901. The QC implementation webpage also includes a phone number and form for contacting the PCAOB regarding standards-related inquiries. If you subscribe to PCAOB News, you should receive a notification when the page is updated with new resources. For more information on the standard and related amendments, please also see PCAOB release number 2024-005 on the PCAOB's website. Thank you for listening and have a great day.